Over the past year or two, I've tackled several Blade Runner blaster builds. There was the RAC kit, the squirt gun repaint, and the Goldberg stub nose blaster. But today, I'm tackling my own version of this iconic prop completely from scratch. Hey there, fellow maker, welcome down to my shop. I'm Bill, and today I'll be showing you how I made my own version of the iconic Blade Runner PKD blaster. After having done several kits of this prop, I decided it was time to make my own from scratch, but with a little bit of a twist. I added my own sort of flair to the look of the gun, kind of like if it was a real product and the design of that product would have been iterated upon over the course of, say, 30 years. Inside the fiction of the Blade Runner universe, of course. A bit of prop making fan fiction, if you will. A while back, I put together an RAC props kit of the blaster, and that's kind of where I started for my design. I also looked at references and technical drawings of the Bulldog revolver that the original prop was built around. All of my references got dumped into Fusion 360, and I started my 3D models. This was probably my favorite part. I would 3D model a piece, print it out on my Ultimaker using ABS filament, and then start putting the parts together. This was an exercise in patience and design iteration. Some of the parts, like the receiver, took several tries to get it just right. I added my own cosmetic upgrades, like the facets on the top barrel and a simpler design for the grips. I also added a couple of structural updates. For example, I split apart the receiver to give myself better access to the hammer and trigger mechanism. This part of the build took me a couple of weeks, mostly in my spare time, but it was fun to always have a 3D print going while I worked on a different part of the build. I really enjoyed making all of the moving parts, like the pop-out cylinder, work properly. I did have to machine a couple of small metal parts on the lathe, but they ended up being super robust and worked out great. After quite a few versions, I finally had an assembly that I was happy with. Of course, I did end up with lots of extra parts that didn't work out. The blue parts were printed in ABS on my Ultimaker 2 Plus Extended, and the clear and black parts were printed on the Form 2 to get higher accuracy on some of the more detailed parts. At this point, I could test that all of the moving parts worked correctly before finishing the pieces for mold making. This meant a lot of sanding. I wanted to make sure the parts would come out of the molds nearly perfect, so I put everything through the gauntlet of sandpaper grips, some of them getting as high as 2000 grit. Some of the spots did need a little bit of filling, so I used an air drying spot putty before sanding. I also sprayed my parts with some primer so that I could see the areas that still needed some work. Other than that, I just sanded the plastic as smooth as possible, and I'm pretty blown away with how smooth I was able to get the raw ABS plastic. Hey, while I'm finishing up that sanding, I'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons. We've been having a ton of fun over there. We've got behind the scenes vlogs every single week, and we've started doing extra credit videos for all of our builds. I'll be doing a deep dive into this project and talking a bunch about the behind the scenes on this one. So if you'd like to join in on the fun over there and also get access to our build videos a couple days early, then head on over to patreon.com/punishprops and consider tossing us a buck. Thanks so much for your support. All right, let's get back to the build. To get the parts extra shiny, I used some plastic polish to really bring up the glossiness on the parts, especially those that were meant to look like black plastic on the finished blaster. I figured I could cast them in a black urethane resin and they wouldn't need any painting. To get the text on the side of the barrel, I put the 3D printed part right inside my laser cutter and etched my own custom text. This worked better than expected. Now, I didn't want to use any glue on the final prop, so I carefully planned out what kinds of screws I would need. I also kept a labeled diagram so I wouldn't forget which screw went where. The prop ended up being over 30 parts in total, and I needed to make a silicone mold for each and every one of them. Most of them were 2-part molds, so it took quite a while. Each part needed to be clayed up to create a parting line before covering that half in liquid silicone. For the inner barrel, I actually 3D printed my own custom mold jacket with built-in registration. It worked out great, and I'm planning on experimenting with more intricate 3D printed mold jackets in the future. The rest of the molding went well, it just took a long, tedious time, especially on some of the more complicated parts like that top barrel. When it was time to pour the second half of the molds, I could flip them over, remove the clay, spray in some mold release, and pour the other halves. I went through a substantial amount of silicone, mostly Mold Max 30, which is a good all-purpose tin cure silicone. When that silicone was fully cured, I could finally remove my parts from the molds and get onto casting all of the final parts. This is where things started to get exciting. Now, to get a metallic finish on the parts that were supposed to look like metal, I used a technique called cold casting. A metal powder, in this case aluminum, was dusted on the inside surface of the silicone mold and the excess was dumped back out. Then the mold was clamped together and liquid resin is poured in to fill the cavity. For a silvery metallic finish, it's best to use gray or black resin, so I use Smoothcast 326 with black UVO pigment. This particular resin gives me plenty of working time to pour the resin in all of those tiny molds. While that resin was still liquid, it was placed inside of a pressure pot to ensure that any remaining bubbles would be compressed so small that they couldn't be seen. This is critical because you can't sand and fill a cold cast finish. The metal powder only makes up a thin outer shell of the resin, and it's far too easy to accidentally chew through it, and it's also nearly impossible to repair. Fortunately, my molds worked out great, and my cold cast parts popped out of the molds looking fantastic. Any flashing was scraped off easily, and I could buff the surface with a fine steel wool to bring out that genuine metallic finish. For the fake bullet inside the magazine, I added brass powder and aluminum powder to just the parts I wanted to be colored. Anywhere that the powder spilled over was cleaned up with a cotton swab and some isopropyl alcohol. This way, I could cast the part with black plastic, and when it popped out of the mold, all I had to do was buff the fake bullet and the entire part was done. No painting necessary. The grips were also cast in that Smoothcast 326, but this time with an orange tint added. This mold was also pressure cast to ensure there would be no bubbles, and the resulting parts looked incredible. Before I could finish the parts, I did need to trim off the extra plastic on my pouring spouts. After cutting them off on the bandsaw, I used my sanding tools to remove the last little bit. On the cold cast parts, I needed to plan the location of those spouts so that you wouldn't see the exposed black plastic when everything was assembled. Any rough cut areas on the black parts simply needed to be sanded and polished back down to that nice high shine. For the lights on the magazine, I drilled out some holes in a tiny piece of acrylic plastic to install several 3mm red LEDs. These were wired up inside the magazine to add that nice red glow to the side and bottom of the blaster. Finally, it was time to put everything together, and I started by drilling and tapping all of the holes. There's over 40 screws on this beast, and I had to be extremely careful. This particular plastic resin will take a thread, but if you over torque a screw, it'll rip the threads right out. The triggers were installed, and while the front trigger only moves a little bit against the spring, the rear trigger actually makes the hammer snap back and forth. This was a lot of extra effort to get the mechanics to work just so, but it is super satisfying, and I'm glad I made it functional. One by one, all of the parts were screwed onto the main assembly until finally it was completed. This guy here is so satisfying. I did everything I set out to do with this project, and I could not be happier. All of the features work. That's right. The bolt opens and slides back and forth. The main trigger does its pew pew. The cylinder actually pops open and closes, just like so. And finally, the magazine pops out and has working lights. As a side note, this was done completely without paint or glue. You heard me, and that was the goal going into this. Hence the cold cast finish and all of these black plastic pieces being completely bare, as well as, of course, the orange grips. That being said, I'm not sure if I want to weather this. I kind of like this fresh from the factory look. What do you think? Should I dirty it up a little bit? Let me know in the comments. Hey, thanks so much for hanging out with me in the shop today. I really do hope you enjoyed this build, and I hope you learned something along the way. As always, all of the tools and materials I used for this build will be linked down in the description, but I'm trying something different with this one. I have a hunch that you're gonna want one of these. So I'm actually going to sell the 3D files so that you can 3D print your own. I've never released any of my 3D files before. This is a first for me. You can find the files for sale over on our website, punishprops.com, for less than 10 bucks. I'll also have an assembly instructional video to go along with that and a full list of all the hardware you'll need to put it all together. Feel free to do whatever you want with the printed parts. If you want to make one for yourself or for someone else, that's totally cool. You want to mold and cast it, go for it. I would appreciate if you didn't share or sell the files, but the prints, go nuts. All the details on that will be in the product description linked below. Okay, that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions about this build, please let me know down in the comments. I also have a lot more behind the scenes stuff to say about this build that I'm gonna do in an extra credit video over on Patreon. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next build.